It's wonderful to be with you. Many of us have spoken in sidebar conversations, and certainly many of you have been subjected to hearing from me in a large audience like this. And listen, in so many ways, many of you are have more of the details of what we need to do in your heads than I do. Suffice it to say that there are complementary interests at work in my administration when it comes to environment and energy policy. I think for a long time in our country, we thought and separated environment from energy policy as if they could not coexist, as if they were not the same thing, and as if there was some conflict of interest when it came to addressing these issues. Now, there is no conflict of interest. There is a direct tie to how we use energy, our energy efficiency, and how we generate that energy to what happens in our environment here in Connecticut, and for that matter in the rest of the country. And in some senses, in the rest of the country may more adversely impact the choice of fuels, may more adversely impact our environment than anything we do locally. At the same time, let me be very clear that there is no conflict between our jobs and economic growth policy and our energy policy. And it's on these subjects that perhaps I have the most to say. In Connecticut, for a long period of time, we have paid too much for energy. And we've paid too little attention to making sure that we are in the senior position when it comes to energy efficiency. If we can increase our efficiency, we can lower cost. If we can lower cost, I firmly believe that we will be better positioned to compete for jobs in the future. And quite frankly, if we had not had as great an expense for a long period of time in Connecticut for the access to electric energy, I believe we would have retained more jobs. So these things are very much connected. And in my mind, when I have my conversations with this great team of people that we've acquired and put together on energy and environmental policy, that's what drives what I'm trying to do. Now, I can also do a quick analysis and realize that we've had some relatively big accomplishments, some of it market-driven, some of it policy-driven. But if you look on a year-to-year basis, we're about 0.8 of a cent less on a kilowatt hour of energy this week than we were exactly 1 year ago. And towards that better policy, we avoided borrowing $675 million and further socking ratepayers with that obligation. Now, I know in the back of your minds, well, some of you are saying, well, you're raising some revenue from energy in a different source, and I have to acknowledge that. But still, we've accomplished what we've accomplished, and still there is much more to accomplish, and we will. I think in some other senses, we've also had great accomplishments in doing something that the legislature and my predecessor were unable to do for a series of years, and that is to pass a new energy bill and a substantially better energy bill than had ever been talked about in the state of Connecticut. And we did that by exercising some degree of leadership from an administration that wants to be involved in policy, as opposed to simply sitting back, waiting for the legislature to deal with an issue, and then deciding whether we were going to sign it or not. This is a very great difference in Connecticut's political infrastructure. And it will continue to play that way throughout the time that I'm governor. We're going to be involved in these discussions. We're going to assemble teams across the board on all important subject matters to make sure that our voice is heard on a policy basis. Now, I'm very proud of that bill. We negotiated that thing over a long period of time. And truth be told, I wasn't sure I'd sign it till about the last 2 or 3 weeks when we finally reached the kinds of agreements across the board that I thought would move us forward in obtaining alternative energies and growing that segment, and making sure that we could obtain the cleanest energy sources, in diversifying that base, and making proactive, positive energy policy from the single home to the biggest user. And I think we did it. Is it perfect? It's probably not perfect. That's why you have other legislative sessions, I suppose. But we can build on what we've accomplished. And I know that throughout today, you'll hear from some of the leaders that I'm working with on a daily basis about what it is we're trying to accomplish in further detail. But let me go back to this other subject. Why it's so important effectively to lower our cost and some of the things that we can do. Number one, I've seen a couple of different rankings over the last couple of years. We're somewhere between 4th and 8th most efficient in the use of energy in the country. And ACEEE ranks us 8th. We should be the most efficient consumer of energy in the country. If we do that, it will help us lower costs. If we do that, it will minimize the cost differential that we have against the rest of the country. If we do that, it will be better for our environment. The CBIA, I suppose, stands for all of those three things that we could accomplish if we can do this. Now, how do we do it? We have to make funds available. We have to drive a positive policy. We have to make the public aware. I mean, one of the things that we really have to do in this state is engage individual consumers in making Connecticut a more energy efficient state. And we have to therefore speak to consumers as well as groups of people like yourselves to do that. I also believe that we have paid more money for energy because simply we put on too many fees and too great an expectation from those fees in that structure. We're going to change that over time and already have started by avoiding, as I previously said, the borrowing of money against those fees. But we have to do other things. We have to be proactive in making sure that energy is available to our state at the lowest possible cost. That's why I've engaged the utilities in discussions, and that's why I have engaged foreign governments, including, most particularly, the provincial leaders in Canada, who will control and currently control or will control in the future potential lower cost access to clean energy through the Churchill various projects in Labrador, and whether that energy can be gotten to our state in a cost-effective way. It's also why I've engaged in discussions with in-state providers about modernizing their facilities and their choice of fuels, again, to drive that cost down. Let me also say that we have a number of other steps that we have to take and have taken, including changing the way in which we buy energy and going to a portfolio concept as opposed to how we were doing it previously. And then I think most importantly, what we're doing in the state, in the establishment of the Department of Energy and Environmental Policy, is once and for all accepting that in a deregulated arena, that we needed someone to specifically drive the adoption of policy across the board. And that's why creating the Energy Department and having a great leader like Dan Esty take the helm and assemble a great team and make very clear that there are various and different functions within that agency, but that they don't necessarily defeat one another. In fact, in the best of circumstances, they work in concert, is so very, very important. Now, I know that's a hard concept for the public to understand, but I know that everybody in this room actually does understand that. In the absence of someone directing that policy, what happened in Connecticut with the DPUC is they looked for opportunities in rate cases and dockets to set policy without the tools necessary to drive the policy formulation from the very start. So now we have, I think, the organization necessary to accomplish that. And I'm looking forward to substantially better policy on an ongoing basis. A few other things that I want to say. We understand that there are lots of people who would like to participate in what fuels are used and what comes to the marketplace. And I'm going to say this in very clear terms. We can't subsidize on a long-term basis every energy source. And I've made it very clear that if you, and quite frankly, if you were in my shoes, you'd understand this. We've got to begin the process of creating jobs after 22 years of failing to create jobs. There is a linkage between being the state with the highest energy costs, with the exception of Hawaii, and the amount of jobs that we've actually lost. I see that linkage. Therefore, we have to have smart policy in the diversification of our renewable sources. There is no blank check to build a renewable portfolio. There is participation. We're setting rates. We got I'm sure you'll hear about it, a request out yesterday or Monday. But be very clear that my administration is very concerned about the issue of cost, and it has to drive, to some extent, our policies. Having said that, I know that within this room, within this state, within this nation, there are people who can be helpful to us in doing all of that. And this is the promise. Every voice will be heard. Every opinion will be considered. But at least now you know what goes into those evaluations and how they have to be made. So let me state quite clearly where in some senses I began months and months and months ago. State government is going to be an active participant. We've set up a new organization to make sure that we're actively engaged and driving the creation of good public policy when it comes to the environment and energy. Your voices will be heard. We have a 9 months down payment of positive, proactive policy, which is already showing results, and we're looking for substantially greater results in the short and long term. That's what I have to say. That's why I came here and come here every time that I'm invited to speak to a group like this, and that's why I'm more than happy to take some questions. Thank you very much. Not bad. At least I was told I was supposed to take questions. Right? Anybody?
Questions for the governor?
No? Yes.
Governor, in the spirit of getting input and opinions out there, any thoughts about maybe some kind of a blog where people could post maybe a one-page white paper, to keep it manageable, to get stuff into the public forum?
Hey, Esty, how come you didn't think of that? Get to work.
Thank you.
Yeah, there you go. Pretty straightforward, right? Who else? No, I think it's a good idea, and I don't actually know. From the question, I assume we're not doing that, and I think we should look for ways to do that. People blog about me all the time.
Governor, I appreciate your comment about cost of renewable energy. I concur with that issue. One of the things, obviously, that's being talked about a lot in the national press is the Solyndra issue. And I think they're missing the point. It's, why did they fail, not that they failed. So I was in New Jersey yesterday. New Jersey's had one of the biggest renewable programs in the country. It put solar panels on a ton of buildings, and in talking with one of the major implementers, I found out that all his panels come from China. And that's fine. They're out-competing folks, et cetera. But I think we really got to look at that issue. If we're going to create policy, if we're going to create incentives, if we're going to use government incentives to do things, we got to think about where those incentives actually go.
Sure. Well, a couple of things. A lot of those panels are using products that actually are developed, manufactured, designed, and created in Connecticut. CRT's participation in that marketplace, I think, is the best example of that. you touched on New Jersey, quite frankly. That's not necessarily at least with respect to the size of the subsidy, the model that we can afford to follow, and quite frankly, they can't afford to follow, unless you fail to make billions of dollars of pension payments, which they've done, and I've decided not to do. So we have to find the right balance. Again, being cost, acknowledging the cost factor. With respect to what do we do about foreign competition, specifically with respect to the lower cost items in the food chain, if you will, it's a tough issue. It's certainly a tough issue, and we have to acknowledge it in a state like ours, which lost a lot of that lower cost manufacturing, in part because of our energy costs. So this thing really does come back pretty quickly. So I don't have a quick fix to world trade issues. I know that over a long time we have to expect more of our world trade partners, both on the environmental side as well as how they treat their labor and their citizens. That's not going to be done overnight. We're not going to get to the right equation, but I'll say this. The United States is going to see more manufacturing than any of us possibly envisioned taking place 5 or 10 years ago. If you look at the larger cost, particularly when the world economy gets humming again, whenever that is, there's no way that we can afford to pay for the acquisition of natural resources in one country, the refinement of those natural resources in another country, the movement of those natural resources, now a product, to another country for use in on the manufacturing side, and then the transportation of that final product to another country. So there's no doubt in my mind, and I think it's fairly clear if you read divergent news sources, that additional manufacturing is going to come back, and in fact is already coming back to the United States. But here's the question I have to ask as the governor of the state of Connecticut. Are we going to participate in that, given our cost structure? And I think based on where we are today, we can't be as hopeful as we would like to be in that reindustrialization. That's why what's happening here today and the driving of policy is so very important, because this is part of that equation. And so we have to address that. And over that, I have a higher level of control than I do on world trade policy at the moment.
Over here, Governor?
Yes. Yep.
Governor Drew Pilato from Advanced Energy. I just want to thank you for speaking today. And you know, on behalf of all the people in the energy sector, the appointment of Dan Esty as well. He's done a great job over the last several months. One question I have for that would probably help, or I think would help all of us in the energy sector, is if the utilities, though they offer certain incentives, also jumped on the bandwagon, and someone like Southern Connecticut Gas implementing geothermal in their office, or UI, CLMP putting solar panels on their utility poles, and I think that would be a great boost to all of us in the energy field, that all of the businesses and residential homes would see that if the utilities are surging forward in this effort, that obviously it obviously has some teeth, because to date a lot of people are you know, confused between global warming, tree hugging, and the actual economical sense of renewable energy.
Well, you know, listen, I know that there are representatives of both utilities that you just mentioned here, and they just heard what you said, and I just heard what you said. But again, I think sometimes I have to bring all of those types of questions and comments back to what am I doing to set an example. So very recently, on a bond agenda, we set aside $20 million for state government to use to drive its own efficiency in the consumption and use of energy. Now, maybe $20 million doesn't sound like a lot of money, but given the circumstances that I've been up against trying to deal with a $3.5 billion deficit, it is nonetheless a substantial down payment. So we're going to drive by example. in state government. And I think we're going to continue discussions with utilities. And by the way, not just, I mean, we can talk about other utilities, including our cable providers throughout the state and our telephone providers throughout the state, about demonstrating leadership in this arena. So when one of them is sitting up here, you ask that again. Yes.
Governor Joe Tyler, 8th Utility District in Manchester. I'd like you to please discuss the climate for cooperation you have set for cooperation between the municipalities on how to cut cost and also how to explore various options they might have for saving energy.
You know, I'm going to go from here to addressing the Connecticut Conference of the Municipalities who are in convention in downtown Hartford. And listen, let's be very clear, in my opinion, and those who have been active in Connecticut state government's energy efforts in the past, I apologize. I think the municipalities across the board, including on the consumption of electricity, have done a far better job in driving efficiency than state government has. Now, I can say that because I was a municipal leader for 14 years and only had 1 year off before I became governor. But I can take that body of experience and compare it to the experience that I've had in the last 9 months. And across the board, municipalities are leading. So I can't preach to them. Because quite frankly, I'm trying to implement many of the things that municipalities have done. Now, you're drilling down to specifics about those municipalities that operate their own utilities. And there again, I think there are lessons that we're more likely to learn from them than we're necessarily going to at least be able to point to and tell them what we've done and what they haven't done. So I think in many ways my approach to the treatment of municipalities is very different from what's happened in about 40 other states where the municipalities have been used to balance state budgets. Most other states in the last budget cycle called savings, state savings, or identified state savings that simply were basically picking the pocket of municipalities. In essence, showering them with the deficit. And by the way, that stage was set when I became governor, because not only did we have a $3.5 billion deficit, but we also had a built-in shortfall on the educational cost-sharing grant, the largest grant that we make to municipalities, of $270 million cut built in. And what we didn't do in Connecticut, I think, is at least indicative of what our approach is, and that's to treat municipalities as partners, to learn from them, and to not shift the burden. Now, we may not be able to increase our aid to cities, although we did slightly this year, and I think we do again by a slight amount next year. We may not be able to play a larger role until the economy recovers, but we're certainly not going to shift our burden. In one state not too far from here, whose governor just recently announced that he wasn't running for president, a state that will remain unidentified, we saw that play out in massive shifts in state aid. So again, this is a cooperative relationship, one that has to be built on mutual respect, and one in which we need to build vehicles or institutions by which we are constantly speaking to each other on a department-by-department basis, and in driving better energy policy. And I want you to know that I think the municipal utilities are extremely important a part of that equation. But I don't have a more specific answer to you. Is that it? Usually when my wife stands up, it means it's time to leave. So, hey, listen, it's been great. I'm sorry. One last question. Let me do it, because he was trying. And you know, the nice thing about him is, during most of my speech, he was shaking his head in a positive way. So, yeah.
It'll be a kind question.
Actually, if you've been doing this, I wouldn't be calling on you. So.
I thank you, sir. David Cooper, Center for a Sustainable Future, Gateway Community College. One of the issues dealing with the new renewable technologies has to do with certification and licensing. And I'm sure your administration is working on this. But I was wondering if you have any, personal opinions or thoughts about how we create a workforce that is both certified and licensed and with processes efficient enough to create the workforce that we need, quickly.
So this was a question you thought I could answer in 5-10 seconds? Is that I gotta be honest. That's not an issue that I personally have drilled. I mean, I'm certainly cognizant of it, and so I don't mean to be ignoring the question. But it's not a policy issue that I personally have drilled down sufficiently deep on that I could actually answer that. So I think the answer, the specific answer, has to await somebody else being up here, so you can ask that question again. But having said that. We talk about the creation of jobs, and I'm quite certain that within our own state, if we were to go from the 8th most efficient user of energy to the 1st in a relatively short period of time, that's going to create jobs, and some of those jobs will be in installing and maintaining and the certifications therefore required. So it's a timely question, it's an important question, but it's not one that I personally can answer. So let me say this to all of you. I've enjoyed being here, probably more than you've enjoyed having me here. I do want to work with you, and I think we've assembled a great team to work with you. Have a great day, and thank you for all you're doing for our country.